Hi, everybody. Hi, and Happy New Year to all of you whom I haven't seen, which is actually most of you in the room. And also, Happy New Year to everybody online, and welcome to this event. I'm Christine McWebb. I'm the Associate Vice President for Faculty Planning and Policy at the university, and I was also the co-chair of the task force on freedom of expression and inclusive engagement. Welcome to everybody in the room. I see we have a full house in the room, and I think we have over 200 participants online as well. So welcome to all of you as well to the second year of the speaker series on antagonism and intimidation in academia. We had last year, so this series was launched in October 2023 for its first iteration, and we had a number of sponsored panels last year on a variety of subjects related to antagonistic and intimidating responses to academic research and pedagogy, with participation from colleagues in all 6 faculties. We had many great conversations, for example, on antagonistic responses to climate change in the academy, health research, gender and race, and other topics. And some of you, I see many familiar faces, so I know that some of you have either participated or attended our past events, and you may also have been at the culminating event of last year's speaker series, which was the International Conference from Targeting in Academia to Promoting Trust and Understanding last June. And a publication of the proceedings is currently underway from the conference, and we will certainly make sure that everybody will be aware when that publication comes out. So this year, we will focus on topics related to freedom of expression and inclusive engagement as part of the university's response to the outcomes of the task force that I just mentioned, and also to explore the ways in which we can foster a culture of free debate and inquiry for our students primarily, but for the entire university community. I'm excited about this, since this is our first event in this series. There will be a couple more this term. And I very much look forward to today's conversation. And I will close it there and just pass it over to Dr. Suzanne Ilken, who's professor in sociology and legal studies, and who is organizing this series. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everybody, all of you in person and online. Nice to see some familiar faces. What I'm going to do in a minute, less than a minute, is to introduce our panelists and our moderator. So we have 2 panel speakers today and 1 moderator. And let me introduce Dr. Mae Lindo, who is actually with us virtually today. She is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Waterloo. She is former member of provincial parliament for Kitchener Centre and Ontario's official opposition critic for anti-racism and equity. She is a knowledgeable advocate for the rights of women and girls and a highly respected activist and educator on vulnerable communities. Dr. Lindo is committed to putting anti-oppression theories into practice. She is also a local TV host of Everyday Politics. And in 2003, Professor served as a member of the University of Waterloo's task force on free expression and inclusive engagement. Our second panel speaker is Dax D'Orazio. Dax is a SSHRC Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Guelph. He's also a research associate with the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's University and a research affiliate with the Center for Constitutional Studies in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta. His key research focuses on law and the politics of freedom of expression in Canada and the system of police oversight in the province of Ontario. Dax leads and hosts the Free Expression podcast, and this is a podcast that blends academic insight with current affairs. And our moderator today is Dr. Emmett Macfarlane. He is professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. His research focuses on the intersection of governance, constitutional law, and public policy, and he has a particular emphasis on rights and institutions. His latest book is Dilemmas of Free Expression by the University of Toronto Press, and also in 2023, Professor Macfarlane served as a member of the University of Waterloo's Task Force on Free Expression and Inclusive Engagement. So please join me in welcoming our panel speakers and our moderator.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Last year, I served on the University of Waterloo's Task Force on Free Expression and Inclusive Engagement, along with our first speaker, Dr. Mae Lindo. What we had on that task force was a group of 11 faculty, staff members, and students who spent many hours doing the work of learning, thinking, and listening to the community about the fraught set of issues relating to free expression on a university campus. Ultimately, we produced a report identifying a set of principles and recommendations with regard to free expression on campus. I think Dr. Lindo would agree that the report our group produced was not what any one of us would have written if we had written it alone. It was certainly a product of some compromise and very careful wording. But what undeniably came through was a strong conviction about protecting the value of free expression, along with a central idea, one that free expression should not be seen as incompatible with, as limiting, or as necessarily balanced against other values and obligations that universities possess, including their human rights obligations or their duty of care to the community. On a personal note, Dr. Lindo was an invaluable member of the committee and an important voice, and we're so lucky to have her here today. She will speak to this duty of care and specifically to how those centers on the university campus charged with doing equity, diversity, and anti-racism work can approach our current landscape around free expression while remaining empowered to effect the university's responsibilities under a duty of care. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mae Lindo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to start off just by apologizing for not being able to be there in person. I had every intention to be in the room with everybody and woke up and my son had gifted me with a stomach bug. So at home I am. But that lets me begin in a way that we often say we want to have these more difficult conversations by beginning well. I'm actually tuned in via Zoom from my home in Kitchener. This land is held down, cared for, loved, and stewarded by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. And we are on the Haldimand Tract. I have often I had been told when land acknowledgements first became part of the fabric of universities and post-secondary more generally, that the most important part of the land acknowledgement isn't so much to know the land, though that is an important aspect, but it's to do the work of thinking about that land acknowledgement and reflecting on how that impacts or changes or influences the conversation that you're about to have. And so because my goal was to have a conversation about what the duty of care is from somebody's perspective who is not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, so that's not where I'm coming at this from. What I kept reflecting on was the fact that oftentimes when we say we're participating in reconciliation work, we note that you can't have reconciliation without truth, that there is a need for us to pay close attention to what has happened in the past in order for us to build and co-create a future that is filled with care and love and joy for all of the people. And I think when we're having these conversations around freedom of expression in the post-secondary sector, and we're thinking of that in relation to the duty of care that the institutions also have, that we also have an opportunity to think of that idea, the duty of care, using that same lens. You can't actually create a caring and compassionate community if you're not willing to look at truth. And so what I want to do is to take a step back. I actually did a quick search to find a simple definition of the duty of care. A lot of my work is actually in the realm of human rights. I do anti-racist work, and that language is quite different than the language that you would have in these other kinds of legal principles. And so I went to, it's actually Thompson Reuters, I think, in the glossary, the duty of care, and they've said a duty recognized by law to take reasonable care to avoid conduct that poses an unreasonable risk of harm to others. So I'm going to repeat that just a little bit slower. So they've said that a duty of care is recognized by law to take reasonable care to avoid conduct that poses an unreasonable risk of harm to others. They've explained that it's a necessary element of the tort of negligence, and so negligence wouldn't be found in a particular case if the defendant owed the plaintiff a duty of care in that particular set of circumstances. In corporate law, I also read and found out that the onus to uphold that duty of care is with the leadership. And so when I think about how that is reflected in a post-secondary the post-secondary sector, or at the University of Waterloo more specifically, I think that there's two big pieces that are important for us to note. The first is that the word reasonable could be seen as subjective, like who decides what's reasonable? We often hear those kinds of arguments. And the second is that the onus of the responsibility is on the leaders to exercise this level of care, or at least to create the climate in which this level of care is able to be well attended to. Now, I can't actually see anybody who's out there, but I'm going to make an assumption that the second piece, that the onus or responsibility being on the leadership, is something that we can all pretty much agree with. Yes, individuals that are outside of traditional leadership spaces also owe each other duties of care. Yes, we are all leaders in our own way. But when I have an institution, the leadership and that leadership structure is usually where these kinds of conditions are actually being imagined and then crafted through policy. And so for that piece, I'm thinking, okay, that makes perfect sense. But the first part about the word reasonable and the potential subjectivity, or the argument that often, like, what would be reasonable is considered subjective, is what I want to trouble today. Because the word reasonable and unreasonable are used within that definition of the duty of care. And I would argue that for a lot of people that experience, again, my focus and research has been on racism and doing anti-racist or racial equity work. I would argue that a lot of people that experience racism on and off university and college campuses believe that there are certain things and examples where it would actually be reasonable for people to understand that the rise of racism will require attention, even as we're having a conversation about the freedom of expression. And so I've come to that conclusion because, as I often do, I try and position the work that I'm doing today within the broader landscape, or the broader political landscape and social landscape. So if I think internationally and I just look at what has been happening in the United States, for example, we have things like the Supreme Court decision of June 29th, 2023, to pull back affirmative action policies. And so it was Harvard College and the University of North Carolina, where that was deemed to be a problematic, that they were upholding these affirmative action policies. We also know that those affirmative action policies policies have a long history of people that have experienced racism and have been consistently underrepresented in colleges and universities, that they fought for these kinds of policies to try to rectify that imbalance. And that imbalance wasn't because people were not good enough to be admitted into the university, but it was because there were policies on the books as well that didn't allow them access. And so that put them behind the mark when it came to being able to apply and get into this sector. We also have a slew of news about corporations that are pulling back their DEI policies. People have reached out to me to talk about McDonald's, about Walmart, about Meta. So the Meta is Facebook and Instagram. Everybody wanting to pull back this DEI work, like we don't need to be doing that anymore. But we also have Costco that made a statement that they would not be pulling back that DEI work, and now has been subjected to quite a lot of tension, with people calling for boycotts and other people saying this is what real leadership looks like in that international space. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there's at UCLA's law school, they have a critical race studies program, and they actually had been tracking policies at various levels of government in the United States. They started tracking in 2020. They finished tracking or stopped tracking December 31st of 2024. And this project was called CRT Forward. And what they were tracking was the anti-CRT policies and pieces of legislation that were being tabled and passed in various states. What you see when you look, they have an interactive map. It's actually quite cool. When you see that landscape, you start to realize that there's a bit of coordination. A lot of the policies that are tabled in one place are the same policies in other places. And so there are questions about what the climate will be for those that would typically have been protected in those spaces. We also know that the soon-to-be president, the president-elect in the United States, Donald Trump, has been very vocal about a desire to make changes to post-secondary education. What we don't know is what that's going to look like, but we do know that a number of universities and colleges have already gotten rid of equity offices, pulled back diversity and equity policies, and label certain kinds of knowledge as problematic and therefore not allowed to be on their university and college campuses. So when we're talking about freedom of expression, we have to think of the history, but we also have to think about how it's playing out right now on these campuses. Nationally, though, we're seeing a similar thing. Just at the beginning of 2025, the president at the University of Alberta, Bill Flanagan, put out, I think it was an op-ed, where he said the university, it's time for them to evolve, and they're moving away from DEI and towards the language of access, community, and belonging. And the rationale that he presented was that EDI or DEI or EDEI language has become polarizing. And so that's part of a newer narrative for us that's becoming more public within that national sphere. And in Ontario, where we are situated right now, we're seeing similar shifts. I know that there's a very big anti-CRT movement that a lot of people haven't been speaking about, but we are seeing it. I've been subjected to it myself when I was a member of provincial parliament, which is its own panel all on its own. Parents First movements that exist in the States to push some of that are also in our location. And some have argued that Bill 166, which the universities and colleges are actually trying to work through right now, that allow the Minister of Colleges and Universities to use ministerial directives, for instance, to decide what equity plans look like, what equity strategies will happen on campus, is a moment in history that we need to pay close attention to as we're having these debates around freedom of expression. If I bring all of that back to where I started, to this notion of the duty of care and the need to think about truth as we are trying to operationalize this duty of care, I find myself wanting to take a deep breath and acknowledge that for a lot of people with this climate, it is reasonable for us to believe that there is concern that the equity work that has been happening on campus will not be invested in. And because both of these duties, both the freedom of expression and the duty of care, are obligations that the institutions have to the people that are at the institutions, both those working and those that are studying there, I want to take as much time as I can to emphasize the need for us to be reminded that we have to do both. That yes, we can have this debate about freedom of expression, but we also have to take seriously what this duty of care is, not in general terms, but within the climate that we find ourselves right now. Um, what that means for me when I think about Bill 166 is that nothing in that bill, for instance, requires the minister to rely on expertise to make decisions about what equity strategies they're going to move forward. They also have a section in Bill 166 on mental health, and it's the same thing. They don't have to ask an expert. They can literally just decide that this is what they think should happen within the sector or at a particular institution. And if those powers are actually utilized, which one has to imagine that if it's possible, because the legislation doesn't require them to speak to experts, that they will not speak to experts, then I worry that we are not actually upholding the duty of care. Because experts on campus, for instance, UW, the EDIR office, would have a good sense of how to actually mobilize the equity strategies. But if we don't speak to them or we bypass them because of what is now allowed through Bill 166, there's the possibility that the equity work that we're doing isn't as equitable as we think. Moreover, it seems to be more focused on accountability measures and less focused on care. And while we do have a lot of conversations within these equity spaces on what accountability looks like, those conversations are often rooted in a desire to move away from carceral approaches to doing this work and towards more caring, holistic approaches to making change within the broader climate in order for people to actually feel like they're held with care and love and compassion. So the very last thing that I want to say, so I can wrap it up and we can get to questions and discussion with the panel, is this. In my humble opinion, from my background, my research background, from my time in politics, from the work that I'm now doing on campus and off campus, I really think that we have to ensure that when we're speaking about freedom of expression, that we do so while also speaking about the duty of care. That these two have to go hand in hand if we're trying to create a climate where we can have difficult conversations, but we are still holding people with care, which means that there are going to be moments when we have to actually address conversations that move from a space of we are just freely debating interesting, difficult topics and towards a place where we're actually suggesting that some people aren't deserving of care, compassion, that we dehumanize others, that we question whether or not they should exist in our spaces. And those kinds of things, in my humble opinion, when I think about the duty of care, that is a reasonable expectation from absolutely everybody on campus. The second thought that I have is that the work that is being done in offices like EDIR, for instance, anybody's equity office at every level of the institution. And I would also add not just the equity office, but the work that we do, for instance, for Indigenous sovereignty. When we invest in offices like Indigenous relations, we're trying to shift the climate because we're recognizing that Indigenous community members have not been treated with care and compassion and love. They are also horribly underrepresented as students, as staff, as faculty in our institutions. Our data is there to prove it. And as academic institutions, we're supposed to care about that data. Then we've got to make sure that we listen to the ways that they have been proposing doing this work. And I've said it before, I just want to say it once more, louder for the people in the back. We've got to shift from carceral logic towards logic of care and compassion. It's not about policing people's behavior. And in fact, a lot of the tensions around freedom of expression is this sense that we are being policed. Well, if we can feel that and we feel that it's reasonable, that that is a reason why I should be allowed to say all the things I need to say, especially within more challenging conversations, then it's also reasonable to see that for no side of this debate does a carceral logic model help us to actually engage well, academically, deeply, with love, care, compassion, whatever language you want to use in our academic spaces. And so that is where I'd like to wrap it up. Thank you so much again for the quick flip to get me virtually, and I will now mute myself and cannot wait to hear the rest of the speakers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lindo, for that. As a good moderator, I will fight every natural instinct in my personality to not editorialize and to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Dax D'Orazio, an early career scholar who has already produced important scholarship on free expression and who has worked to inform Canadian debate about the campus context, including via a free expression podcast hosted at the Centre for Constitutional Studies at the University of Alberta. Although there are many scholars across many disciplines across Canada working on topics adjacent to free expression, issues like misinformation, hate and hate crimes, conspiracy theories, election regulation, and the like, there are surprisingly few who focus primarily on free expression itself as an object of study. Dr. D'Orazio's scholarly and public-facing work on free expression, I think, is likely to be a key driver animating thinking about public policy, law, and the politics of campus speech issues. And we are lucky to have him joining us today to speak to whether it is possible to have a principled approach to free expression in the university setting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dax D'Orazio.
I think you just signed yourself up to be my personal job talk consultant. Thanks for that, Emmett. I'm also going to resist every temptation to go over 20 minutes and keep this nice and trim and on time, so I'm going to dive right in. But say thanks for the invitation and a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. So my presentation is broken up into 3 different pieces. The first one is the why and the how, which is why are we talking about freedom of expression on university campuses to begin with? The second piece is why is it so hard to create and regulate expressive limits on campus, so getting a bit closer to the heart of the matter. And then I'm going to do some of my own editorializing and say what a principled approach to freedom of expression would look like on university campuses. So I want to take you back to a time that you might not remember before the pandemic. It was around 2016, 2017. A couple of years before, we had a series of cases and controversies related to free expression or free speech on American university campuses, and they were slowly trickling into Canadian public discourse and arousing some public attention. And then the fall of 2016, something major happened. We have the Jordan Peterson affair at the University of Toronto campus. The following year, we have the Lindsay Shepherd affair at Wilfrid Laurier University campus. The consequence of these 2 twin controversies is that the headlines were just constantly filled with stories, sometimes appearing like a moral panic about an alleged crisis of freedom of expression on university campuses. What happened subsequent to that is we have a conservative provincial government that comes into power with a pretty healthy majority, made freedom of expression on campus an actual campaign promise, and then quickly put it into effect as a really low-stakes policy objective, quite easy to satisfy. So what did they do? They told all institutions within Ontario that they needed to have a definition of free speech or freedom of expression, that they needed to have a standalone policy governing freedom of expression, and to make sure that there was consistency across their entire policy and practices suite. And they also had to start doing some bean counting, which related to how many events they were hosting on campus, a general aggregate amount, how many cancellations or reschedulings happened, and also how many complaints were lodged internally. Another piece of this legislation, this ministerial directive, was to create a more formal mechanism for accepting complaints related to free expression on campus. We now have 6 years of data as a result of this public policy, and dare I say it, does not quite look like the crisis that it was initially made out to be. So I'll just go over 2023 and 2024. So in 2023, Canadian universities collectively estimated that 70,000, this is a conservative estimate in the words of the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, who the reporting filters through, and then there's an aggregate report pulling all the institutional reports together. So 70,000 is a conservative estimate. 0 cancellations in that calendar year. There were 2 reported delays for planning and safety, 10 formal complaints, and all were resolved internally. This most recent year, an estimate of over 100,000 events on all campuses, 3 cancellations and 1 delay, and 22 complaints, all resolved internally. I have an asterisk here because the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario stipulates that there was a jump in complaints related to the politics of Israel-Palestine on campus, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And they also stipulate that it's impossible to track all of the complaints because they can also be escalated to the Ombudsman of Ontario. And because of privacy regulations, universities might actually not know or understand the trajectory of those complaints, and so they're not actually well positioned to provide further details about those. So we have a handful of controversies that fill news headlines. New public policy in Ontario, also a similar one in Alberta, and then another one in Quebec that deals with academic freedom. Quite a stark difference between the public reaction and the antagonism that followed and the actual reporting that we have. Why is this still relevant? Well, I started writing a book about freedom of expression on campus several years ago, and it's a really difficult project to finish because I feel like I have to tear it up and then start over again. And the last year has been incredible on this front. There's been some of the most significant campus protests in Canada and the United States since the 1960s. Bit of a different story in Europe with a different protest culture. And for that reason, I think the last year has been the most significant test for free expression on university campuses. The encampments and protest movements challenge university decision-making in 3 major ways. There's a bunch of others I might mention, but I'll quickly mention 3. The first major thing that they did is they really contested the predilection to understand campus property as inherently private. If you look at jurisprudence in this area, you'll see universities often hanging their hat on the fact that they have private property rights and that the charter doesn't apply. The indefinite use, occupation, if you want to use that term, of campus spaces really changes the dynamic of how we understand campus spaces and really highlights some of their democratic character and also their public character, so there's a real tension there. They also obviously pose a strategic problem for institutional decision-making in that there really is a no-win situation from the institution's perspective. Almost inevitably courting negative headlines, which deals reputational blows, at least potentially. You want to balance freedom of expression. If you have a heavy-handed approach, nobody wants to see headlines and pictures of protesters being dragged off. So there's a really delicate balance, and it's often, in the realm of public relations at least, a lose-lose scenario. They also have contested the notion of institutional neutrality, where you see institutions becoming relatively comfortable in the last 10 years making pronouncements about moral, political, ethical, social, and cultural issues. And more savvy members of the public might look at institutional decision-making and statements and say, well, on this issue, you seem to be associated with this side or these sides of the issue. On this issue, you seem to be associated with this side. And so there's a real question mark here about transparency and decision-making, and then also having consistency across some of the public statements that universities are making. So that's another huge challenge. There have also been a wide range of responses to encampments and protests. I won't go into rabbit hole here, but they range in the spectrum from, on the one hand, negotiated settlements, so talking to protesters and coming to some sort of arrangement to end encampments, all the way to calling in the police and having them forcefully excised from campus spaces. And so in some of my future work, I'll be actually cataloging some of these responses and trying to understand, well, why did certain universities respond in this way and not another way, and how might things have been better addressed. To the second point, why is it so hard to create and regulate expressive limits? The first reason it's so hard is because universities don't have one single limit or line that we can point to or we can draw. They're actually a complex mix of different laws and policies that apply in different ways and in different places. Universities are employers. They furnish housing for people. They also, like was already mentioned, have a duty of care to different people in different scenarios. They're balancing a whole bunch of different statutory obligations and expectations on campus, and sometimes some of these come into conflict with one another. Just to give you an example of the different limits and lines that we might draw, the campus quad is much different than a classroom, where the latter would have much more restrictive boundaries for expression. So it's just really important to emphasize that, when you see an op-ed saying that this is where the limit should be for free expression on campus, the first question to ask is, well, where? We don't have a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all answer. Not only do we have to look at the individual spaces to have some differentiation, we also have to look at hard facts in specific cases and instances. So I gave you a sense of some of those laws and policies that come together to give us the limits. I want to focus on 4 really quickly that I think are important and generate the most anxieties or tensions. So the first one is norms of scholarly merit. Universities are open in some respect to the general public, so sometimes you might be able to book a room and come on campus and do your thing. But typically, campus spaces or podiums or platforms, there's some sort of vetting that happens in order to access that space. And really, that's a good thing. It's a part of the university working properly. Not everyone has access to a podium on a university campus, and nor they should. Likewise, academic expression is vetted professionally in a self-regulating manner using norms of scholarly merit. And so if I write a journal article and editorial board says, this isn't so hot, we're not publishing it, my freedom of expression hasn't been violated in any significant way, if at all. That said, as an academic, if I'm protected by academic freedom, I'm invited, indeed protected, on commenting on public affairs way outside of my own disciplinary expertise. Arguably, there's a good reason for protecting that type of expression, but extramural expression does not have the same, say, marketplace or ideas, or same rules and responsibilities that you might have within regular academic spaces. And so looking at how that space is regulated, related to expertise and knowledge and experience, is a huge tension. How much latitude should we give to individuals on campus to be able to comment in public affairs on things that are important, even when they have no disciplinary knowledge or expertise or experience related to that? Second, we have time, place, and manner restrictions. So universities are not a free-for-all. You can't just waltz in and use campus space for whatever you'd like to do. You can't disrupt the normal operations of the university. That's a pretty clear limit on your freedom of expression. Protests are a tension here in the sense that there's no such thing as an effective protest that doesn't disrupt things or bother people. That's the point of getting people to pay attention to you. But if something occupies space, is indefinite, and might interfere with the ability of others to use that space, there's a really complicated discussion to have about how you protect freedom of expression and also have a time, place, and manner restriction that's legitimate. Third, we have statutory obligations. I think the most important one, if we're talking about a duty of care, is something like the Ontario Human Rights Code. We also have the Criminal Code. We also have occupational health and safety regulations. These ensure that people that are within the campus community aren't objects or subjects of things like hate speech, of harassment, of discrimination based on prohibited grounds. That said, these are reasonable limits, but most of the expression that causes cases and controversies related to freedom of expression exist in a really uneasy liminal space. They might be offensive in the sense that they make us feel uncomfortable. They might even be, in a sense, targeted, but they don't rise to the threshold of passing a legal limit of being harassment, discrimination, or hate speech. And so there's a lot of discretion at play in institutional decision making when this is the case. Lastly, a huge part of the response to encampments and student protests in the last year, but also over the last several decades, is student codes of conduct. We assume that universities will have appropriate restrictions on expression within the codes of conduct. There are still questions to be asked about procedural justice, given the power imbalance between students and institutions. Also transparency, so we have to balance privacy and transparency also, not getting intimate details about complaints, but what did the subject matter actually look like perhaps, or how did a university respond to it? And also, what is the scope of student codes of conduct? Does it apply to expression or behavior off campus? And can universities extend their decision-making off of campuses virtually and also physically? So these are some of the key tensions that I think. So the last bit, what would a principled approach look like? I'm happy to editorialize for a bit here. The culture wars on campus have given us two dueling meta-narratives. One is that freedom of expression on campus is threatened due to censorious and intolerant students. They're largely emboldened by left-leaning administrators and professors, and so free expression, or universities are essentially where free expression goes to die. The second meta-narrative is largely a response to this one, and it is that concerns about free expression are really part of a long-standing backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, and especially demographic and epistemological diversification. So more and different types of people are now contributing to knowledge production, and their free expression is often, in that context, just a very convenient shield for forms of expression that might have been acceptable several decades ago and now no longer are. The problem with polarization in general is that you feel like you have to perfectly fit into one camp or the other, or that you develop your position in opposition to somebody else's position without thinking about what the first principle might be to drive practice and decision making. So I want to offer just a handful of things here for what I think a principled response would look like. The first one would be alignment of policies and practices with statutory obligations. So I mentioned before that universities have a bit of discretion in that liminal expression that they're sometimes responding to. So I think what they could do is embrace the hybrid nature of campus spaces as public and private, but putting into practice a public good, which is education, pursuing truth and knowledge and greater societal understanding. They can also get over their allergy of the charter, I think, and not necessarily think in legal terms, and perhaps imbibe some charter values in valuing freedom of expression. So not going further than their statutory obligations, I think, would be a really good first step. Second is, and this isn't a diss to anybody in the communications portfolio here, but amending public relations strategies to tell more positive stories and not be too keen to throw members of the community under the bus in order to put out fires institutionally. There may be a place for storytelling within public relations, but I really think that freedom of expression could be woven into that. Strengthening the annual reporting to the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, I think, would be really fascinating. At the moment, it's very perfunctory, where universities are essentially submitting a shot-in-the-dark estimate of how many events are happening on campus, mentioning a little bit about complaints and how they may have been resolved. I think they could use this as an iterative process to keep imbibing charter values as it relates to freedom of expression, keeping it as an institutional conversation that is constantly stoked, and also figuring out other ways to ensure that free expression is woven into other policies and practices, so they could actually go much further than what their obligations are in this manner. Next, I think clear complaints, policies, and practices are really important. If you talk to anybody that is in, say, a human rights or an equity office, a lot of times you'll have students, others within the institution, levying complaints or concerns where the focus is expression that might be uncomfortable, it might be offensive, but it doesn't necessarily pass a legal or a policy threshold. And so communicating to the community what those thresholds actually look like, what case law looks like, and also highlighting restorative approaches to complaint mechanisms, I think would go a long way in somewhat defraying some of the tension and antagonism around free expression on campus. And lastly, as a pedagogue myself, I have to mention pedagogy. Most of the teaching that's done on university campuses these days is done by those without a lot of training and mentorship, also those without very strong labor protections. And so that just creates a system of risk aversion where you might avoid conversations because you're doing a very crass cost-benefit analysis about opening up a can of worms in a difficult conversation. Having more training and mentorship for especially junior scholars would be huge. Professors have a really strong role to play in modeling healthy debate and discussion on campus. And I think developing a strong culture of teaching and pedagogy and training and mentorship can combat some of the antagonism that we see around freedom of expression on campus. That's it for me. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So our two speakers have, I think, given us a lot to think about. We're going to move to the Q&A portion of today's event. We will be taking questions both from the floor, and so I hope there's a mic circulating for that, as well as from our online audience. I also have some of the questions that were submitted in registration ahead of time. So I might pose one of those to break the ice here for either or both of our speakers. All right, so the first question that came through is as follows. Many professors have been criticized for speaking up against the genocide and scholasticide in Gaza, where universities and libraries have been destroyed and countless students and academics have been murdered, including a former UW faculty member and more recently 2 incoming UW PhD students. We have also seen Jewish professors losing their jobs for supporting Palestine and standing up against genocide. How do we ensure that this sort of censorship does not come to the University of Waterloo? And I don't know if either of you would like to take a first stab at that very easy question.
I'm not sure. So just so that you know, I can't actually see anything. I can see you, Emmett. How you doing? But I can't see anybody else, so I feel badly if I just jump in and unmute, but I'm going to jump in and unmute.
Please.
I can be fast. Oh, wait, I saw him. Hi, Dax. How you doing? Okay. I don't know if this is really going to answer the question, but I want to connect it to something that I was pondering when I was listening to Dax speak. One of the challenges when it comes to addressing freedom of expression on campus is the assumption that policies that exist are neutral. And unless we have a real conversation about the I would say inherent, but lack of neutrality of these policies, then it's difficult to call on policies to help us to address these kinds of things, because we're calling on something and then sort of not talking about what's really at the bottom of that. And so when we've seen institutions that are challenging the freedom of expression of folks that are trying to draw attention to a genocide that's happening in real time. Part of the issue is that we're seeing policies that are supposed to be neutral being mobilized in less than neutral ways. But we don't want to talk about that. We just want to talk about freedom of expression. And so, again, I don't know what to do with this information. I just know that when I call for the engagement, like actual deep engagement with experts on campus, what I'm trying to get at is how folks that do this kind of work pay attention to both the spirit of the law or the spirit of the policy and how it has been mobilized on campus. Because if we don't pay attention to how it has actually been mobilized on campus, we are going to find ourselves in more and more of these moments where we say we're going to fire this professor because they have not upheld these ideas of freedom of expression. But then people will say, but they were actually freely expressing a different idea. And now all of a sudden it feels like the world is topsy-turvy. The words don't mean what they used to mean.
To take up something that you mentioned about the presumed neutrality of policies, a longstanding critique of student codes of conduct, for example, is that they're written in such broad terms that it in effect gives university decision making too much discretion. And so what they end up doing is meting out punishments in a very disproportionate and unfair manner. And there's quite a bit of evidence, I think, to show that the investigations and the disciplinary proceedings are actually very, I would say, non-neutral, or at least student codes of conduct are written in a way that gives institutions perhaps too much discretion. For somebody that's, to return to the original question, the last part of the question was, how do we prevent this type of censorship or self-censorship from coming to the University of Waterloo? I haven't visited a single university campus where I haven't talked to someone who is absolutely petrified of discussing Israel-Palestine in an open and forthright manner, irrespective of where they line up and how they feel about that conflict and history in that region. If you look at academic freedom cases, Israel-Palestine is a consistent theme. And I think what Israel-Palestine shows us over the last year is that we see almost the shoe being on the other foot, in a sense. For the longest time, you had progressives on campus that were, in some instances, quite comfortable seeing the coercive power of, say, the state or an institution being used to mute or silence the expression of someone else if they disagreed with what their opinion was or thought it was genuinely harmful. Now you see people who were complaining about political correctness and cancel culture and the campus crisis enthusiastically cheering on the widespread suppression of criticism of the state of Israel. And so on both sides, progressives and conservatives, they've almost changed teams over the last year. And that, I think, shows you that what the culture wars tend to do is just erase a principled approach to some of these questions. I think the most important test is to say, irrespective of how I feel about this, am I comfortable giving somebody else, an institution, a person, a government, the ability to limit somebody else's freedom of expression when I agree with them or disagree with them? Does it actually matter how I feel about the issue itself? And I feel like that question is the way that you get to a principled approach to these questions. And just to answer it again, I haven't visited a campus where I haven't seen some form of self-censorship on this topic. And it's most difficult for those that are teaching and do not have very good labor protections and are contingent or precarious. And it's a serious issue on university campuses.
Do we have a question from the floor? Yeah.
Hi, just so if I could closer. Yeah, thank you. So there is that, if we're talking about intimidation, antagonism, and the lawsuit of $1.5 million, that's very much of an intimidation. To my mind, that's like a huge amount of intimidation. I want to talk about using the language, centers of power in academia or outside of academia, using or co-opting the language of inclusion. Dr. Lindo mentioned policies are not neutral. Those with money and power, they will use, Dax, you mentioned our kind of all these rules, and perhaps they're too lax, but what about those in power, centers of power, money, they will abuse these rules to get whatever outcome they want. And example, I was looking at the other day the University of Toronto's definition anti-Semitism. And this was apparently lauded by, well, Emmett, you kind of mentioned that this is a good example of, how you should approach it. But, then, I feel it co-opts the language of EDI, like inclusion, to kind of, kind of push the agenda of those incentives of power, because it mentions, it's racist to exclude, for example, Israeli institutions, Israeli individuals from research environments. It's racist to include in, work environments. And I'm thinking, apartheid South Africa, there was, the movement against, to boycott, BDS for that. And even Russia now, Russian tennis players are not allowed. Are we racist against Russians? Of course not. But why, why do we have, use this, they co-opt the language of inclusion, EDI, to kind of, to push that agenda here where they want to, have, normalize apartheid, genocide now. So I'm wondering, about centers of power in academia, co-opting the language of EDI, inclusion. Dr. Lindo, mentions policies are not neutral. And this latest example from the University of Toronto actually is an example, it's kind of a really bad example of pushing, status quo with regards to those with power and money. And it's actually a bad example, I would say, Emmett, regarding, regardless of what you have written last month about this. It's actually not, this is not a good example, basically, because it talks about exclusion. They're using the language of EDI to actually push their agenda here of normalizing genocide and apartheid. And that's actually very concerning to me. And you did not actually flag it in your post last month. And what were you thinking here? Both to you and to the panel itself. Thank you.
Sure. I guess I'll go first. I wasn't expecting a direct question to me, but and I'm not sure if our guests are familiar with the policy statement or my newsletter post on that. I think we are just fundamentally disagree about the nature of that statement. The idea that it is illegal and or discriminatory to exclude Jewish or Israeli students from specific events on campus or the classroom is a statement of law in Canada and not an agenda item. What I was praising the University of Toronto's statement on anti-Semitism for is that it avoided the pitfalls of other definitions of anti-Semitism that would preclude criticism of Israel, criticism of Israeli actions, that would see accusations of genocide be automatically equated with anti-Semitism. I was endorsing that particular statement as one that met the bounds of Canadian law, precisely because it didn't engage in the sort of overreach that you seem to be reading into it. And so I think perhaps we just fundamentally disagree about our interpretation of what that statement actually says. No, it does not speak to BDS as a policy, right? This is not about boycotting institutions. It's not about visa rules, about who's admitted into the country. It's if we have on our campus, if we have international students from Israel, we are not allowed to block them from entering any event or any facility on campus on the grounds of their ethnic or country of origin. That's a statement of Canadian law. I don't know if Dax or Laura may want to.
I feel like we could have a completely separate panel about this debate and discussion. I think it's a really tricky issue that a lot of university campuses are dealing with right now. If you look at the early origins of anti-racist literature, even some canonical texts in critical race theory, even they were grappling with this question as well. And even within Canada, you'll see some splintering and some tensions between the anti-racist community and the Jewish community as it concerns anti-racism. Part of this happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where you see a bit of a separation and not as much collaboration as there once was. One of the dominant themes or concepts that came out of critical race theory and also anti-racism in the 1990s was that those that are on the receiving end of, say, hate speech and racism and discrimination, they are the ones that should be entrusted to define and conceptualize what their exclusion discrimination looks like. And so, generally speaking, I think that's entirely legitimate. The question in this case is where you have a potentially expansive definition of anti-Semitism, and some people make the case that the IHRA, not in the definition itself, but in the illustrative example, some of them are expansive. The tension here is, why would it be not possible for those that are the objects or the targets of discriminatory expression not be able to define what that actually looks like using their own identities and their own experiences? And so to deny that ability in one circumstance but not others, there's a tension there. So for me, that's really the heart of the issue. That's not to say there might be some cases in which there are overexpansive definitions, which is why unions in Canada, for example, and many other organizations and even universities have had immense trepidation in adopting the IHRA and struggle currently and will for decades in trying to navigate some of these issues on campus.
I was going to just jump in as well, and usually when I say the kinds of things I'm about to say, I look at people and make sure we're in a room of love. So let's just hope that on the other side there is a room of love to hold what I'm about to tell you. I am going to say this as both somebody with Jewish lineage and somebody who is Black, and somebody whose complicated histories would actually be one of the people that would be centered to be able to help find what these definitions might be. I think the reason that it has been difficult is because a lot of folks have recognized or argue under the umbrella of anti-racist understandings or anti-racist approaches to existing in this world, that not all Jews agree on all the things. And part of what we have seen is that the state has selected a definition at the same time that Jewish community members with various opinions have been trying to have the debate. And so it reminds me of one of the biggest anti-racist principles that I think I have learned through my own understanding and analysis of things like critical race theory, that racism is operating at the system level. And I think that that's what we're not actually understanding. And I'm saying, again, from a place of love, because the system is what has actually caused us to have all of this harm, but the answer that they are proposing, and I'm using air quotes, is to penalize individuals for saying and doing things. So we're going right back to like basic anti-racist education that needs to happen at the senior level of institutions, because that isn't where a lot of the equity knowledge holders are. There's also a question inside the chat or inside the Q&A around how do we reconcile freedom of expression with UW's commitment to indigenization, decolonization, reconciliation? And I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I am. I'm connecting these two questions because we can't do the work if at the leadership level, the only conversations in post-secondary between government that is trying to mandate particular ways of being on campus and particular knowledge production, and the leadership are the only people having the conversation. And sometimes it's not because the leadership doesn't want to bring in the experts, it's because the government has chosen to not allow the experts to speak. And so what I would like to see is that the leadership that is in fact having the conversation with whoever the ministerial liaison is says, I won't talk to you until my equity expert in my institution, who has already created a bunch of these policies, that's literally holding a host of conversations of these tensions and actually resolving a bunch of things on campus, is sitting in the room with me. Like, if we empower the experts, we can have a very interesting conversation. But right now, what worries me the most is that the people that are making the policies have now pushed us into I don't know if they can push us into. The people that have that are creating these policies are creating the conditions in which we forget that racism is actually operating within the same systems that they are trying to mobilize.
Thank you. Is there another question from the floor?
Hi there. Apologies, I have my sunglasses on. I had an eye exam today, so lights are a little bit bothering me. I had a question for Dax, I believe. In addressing the freedom of expression in policies, I believe one of the recommendations that you made was don't go further than what is statutorily obligated. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. On the other hand, when speaking on complaints, you have suggested to look at the legal threshold. And if these are violated, then we would pursue or resolve the issues. But I kind of see a vicious circle going on there because, as Dr. Lindo was saying, policies don't fully address hate crimes or other things, and neither does law. So when we look at those who typically have power to make those laws or policies, well, we know who those people are. And I think that we drew that picture there. But I think that as a university, we can't just do what's statutorily obligated. And if we're a higher education institution, it may require more. And so I just wanted to know, what was the justification for that recommendation?
I mean, the simple answer is to say that it opens up a legal can of worms. And what will happen is you have a strategic legal liability in cases where students, for example, are disciplined for expression that doesn't meet a legal threshold, and the onus is on the university to say that they have a good reason for doing so. That's not to say that they can't come up with other ways of addressing things that cause tensions or fractures on campus, or even forms of expression that reasonable people might say is even harmful or distressful. But as far as the institution using its coercive power in forcing people to do something, they get into the danger zone when they go much, much further than the law. The other thing that you have to bear in mind, I think, is just a truism about, well, two truisms about freedom of expression, and this isn't just in the contemporary moment, but since freedom of expression has been around. One is that we're much more likely to extend protection and be comfortable with expression that we agree with. And the obverse is true. We're much less likely to want to extend protection to expression that we don't like. That's not to say that expressive harms don't exist. They do. But it's really important to recognize that. The second thing is, if you are allowing an institution, a state, someone else that has power to restrict expression, you have to ask yourself, would I be willing to have my own expression restricted when somebody else disagrees with me or thinks that I'm being harmful? Are you comfortable, as a conservative, as a progressive, however you understand yourself, giving the institution the power to be able to do that? And you might be thinking as a progressive, well, I feel quite comfortable because universities will always be progressive spaces, and I'm always surrounded by my peers and my colleagues that mostly think and act like me in the world, but that might not always be the case. That same power and authority can be used in ways that are counterintuitive to you and your impulses and your political predilections. So I think that's always important to bear in mind. And the case of Israel-Palestine is a perfect example where we have seen people who have been on the receiving end of that discretionary decision-making from universities, and when we thought, oh, these are awful people, I don't really mind if the institution doesn't let them book a room or protest or do whatever. People didn't really care. Now it's expression that people care about and think is important and morally just. And the institution is using its weight to say, no, these are actually time, place, and manner restrictions. You can't have space here. You can't speak. It's a pretty good learning example, I would say, of why we need to be really careful who we give power to decide what the limits are going to be, including a university campus that generally is a very responsible actor in the world.
Thanks, Dax. Laura Mae, did you have anything on that point? Or?
I have so many things. Sorry. I have so many things. So I'm going to say 3 of them in no particular order. One of the other challenges that I think we're having in these discussions around freedom of expression is that for many of us, and I will put myself in that group, these institutions have actually not been caring kind places that have allowed us to speak. And in fact, that's why the history of how some of these policies have come to be is so important. It's why we have to make sure that we're actually investing rather than dismantling equity offices. You can call it by a new name. I have my own feels about like diversity as people. If you had been at one of the other talks I was at, I think I did diversity training for everybody. Like, look around, you're all different, diversity training done. That isn't helping the cause when it comes to how people are actually treated in the law, their access in university, all of that kind of stuff. So the language itself was already problematic, but within those problematically labeled spaces, experts finally had a voice to be able to try to do some of this actual work on the ground in a space that was never actually created for them. So I think it's important for us, no matter what it is that we're doing, to trouble the histories that we believe are pushing the agendas that we're actually trying to address. The last thing I just want to say for the record is that another challenge that we often see, like CRT was created to actually critique the law. So it never believed in the objectivity. Folks that are writing in that area don't believe in the objectivity of the law. When it comes to race, they see these examples of when the law is not actually being objective. And so with that as the backdrop, we have to be reminded that the other policies that people point to, that folks that are harmed by free expression are asked to go to, free expression in the way that they want it to be now, the free expression that we're having a tug of war over. We say go to the OHRC that is now underfunded. And where you're waiting 7 to 10 years before your case even goes forward. That's trauma for that time that you're actually waiting for it to go forward. Hate crimes, the bar is so high that nothing ever meets the bar. And so because it never meets the bar, everything in free expression is allowed to go. And so if we're not, again, truthful about how these pieces of legislation and internal policies that have developed as a consequence of it have been made and the historical realities of why these things are happening, I don't know that we're going to create anything new that's going to help us to move forward in a different way.
Thank you. I'm going to take one of the live questions from online. It reads, can UW admin put some serious consideration to making anti-racist and anti-oppression training mandatory for all employees? WMIS, computer security, sexual harassment training are all currently mandatory, for example, and we could and should easily be able to tack on more topics of study. Laura Mae, any particular pros and cons to that idea?
Yeah, I think there are always pros and cons to anything that an institution says is going to be mandatory. Again, we've seen a similar kind of push with accessibility. Rather than fighting for deep learning about something, like we would never make, instead of, I was going to go into a tangent, but I'm going to try and save you. Instead of fighting for deep learning about the experiences of folks with disabilities and the nuances of those experiences, we have like an online training, you press all the buttons, you pass, you're done. You don't have to change your practice, which is actually the thing that's going to make a university more or less accessible. You just have to pass this little test. And so I personally have a lot of feels about what happens when we argue for these kinds of trainings to be mandatory. But what I would like to see is if we do in fact make something mandatory, and that goes for the sexual violence prevention training, the accessibility training, etc., that there's a follow-up that's also required, and that follow-up keeps happening. And that in the follow-up, people are asked, how has this changed your practice? Well, with accessibility, I've now figured out more about how the accessibility office works. I've been able to ask for help to figure out how I can adjust my curriculum expectations, or how I can adjust the pedagogical strategies I use, all of that kind of stuff. But that also helps the unit that's in charge of overseeing accessibility, because now they know what works and what doesn't. We need a similar kind of approach if we're going to make something like anti-racism training mandatory, where we have a space where the folks that are experts in this can help to guide you to find ways to apply what it is that you're learning in theory. One of the biggest issues that I have seen when it comes to the work I have done on training in anti-racism is that people find they get the theory, they have no idea how to apply it in practice. Many people don't even think it is applicable to their work. And so that piece is what's needed. But you can't get there if you start to dismantle the offices where that expertise is held. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what's happening at UW. I've been here for about 5 seconds. But I do know that we have this history of equity offices that are closing. And so I think it would be wrong-headed for us to add another thing to the mandatory training that allows the institution to believe that they have done real equity work, when in fact the institution itself, the students, the faculty, the staff, there's another question in the chat that's actually talking about what happens if you're a professor and this is the work that you do, how are you being held? Like, none of that is actually being discussed. So those are just my cautions.
Dax, what are you seeing in terms of a direction? Are universities moving this way, or to other models of training? What are your thoughts?
I'll mostly defer, but just maybe pitch one observation here. Maybe this is based on my own experience, because I don't like being told what to do, and I just assume that other people don't like being told what to do. But mandatory trainings are usually dreadful, just in the abstract. Especially when you're being onboarded as a new employee. That's not to say that what you're learning is not important and statutorily obligated. So when you have a really important imperative like anti-discrimination, anti-racism, DEI, whatever you want to call it, the question for me is really a pedagogical question, which is, how do you create something that doesn't tune people out, make them cynical, get their back up against the wall? How do you actually call them in, make something that's engaging, inviting, and interesting? So for me, it's ultimately a pedagogical question.
Do you have another question from the floor? We have time for maybe one more.
I see one down here too.
Yeah, I just want to, we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's, the 94 calls to action. And so far, only a handful of them have been done. And, in my mind, like, arguably the only place where Truth and Reconciliation has been really successful is in South Africa. Here, not so much. Even like on campus, for example, like UW administration, you design in indigenous buildings. You can like have these kind of like, I feel like performative displays, but when it comes to actually like engaging in actual, this truth information, in real life, as Dr. Lindo, mentions, in action rather than just, a performative. We don't actually do that much, if at all. Right now, the administration, it's suing Camp into $1.5 million. And this is, against genocide, and then basically, like, the administration, sided with, the status quo with power, and the federal government, our institutions, and even, you talk about professors being fired. Even professors who are protected, have tenure, they engage in acts of self-censorship for most cowardly reasons. For example, like certain professors, they have like a little Ukraine flag on their Twitter handles, Dr. Emmett, and but not a Palestine flag, because Otherwise, I don't know, they could be like excluded from their social circles. I mean, for the most pathetic reasons. I mean, this self-censorship, it doesn't have to even be. I mean, you would not be fired for that, but just choose, I have a performative, I side with Ukraine, but when it comes to, much worse war crimes, no, you're silent on that, and it's very sad. I'm not a performative, I'm not sure what we can do to kind of go against that, to kind of energize people to, even who are relatively safe, who have tenure, and yet kind of to stop self-censoring. I don't know what can we do to get rid of this cowardice. It's almost like a plague. I don't know. What can we do about that? Thank you.
So I want to maybe try to condense that into a question. Are you asking how do we address potential self-censorship even among professors, or?
Well, I mean, a lot of performative acts by institution, even by the federal government, at the individual level by professors of tenure. And I'm thinking, what can we do kind of get rid of this cowardice, even at the individual level, when there's no repercussions of material harm? Maybe socially excluded from their circles, but having a little house that's considered too controversial, might not do that. It's kind of pathetic. What can we do about that?
So I guess a question for our guests is, to the extent that we accept the premise that there's a bit of a weak culture at stake here, how do we strengthen that? Easy question to end the day with.
Sure, I'll go first. I think the insight here is, and this returns to something I might have mentioned during my presentation, or could have mentioned during my presentation, is that when we're trying to understand where the limits actually are, our almost reflex is to look at something that's written down in a law or a policy that will give us some, general, usually vague language. We might look at jurisprudence to see how, based on facts, laws are interpreted. We might look at university policies and how those are interpreted in institutional decision making. Those are consequential, but the most consequential factor in the regulation of these limits is actually everyday talk and text. We're always self-regulating what we say, in what context, and with other people. And so self-censorship is this really interesting, slippery concept as a social scientist. Maybe my social scientist is leaping out here. It's really difficult to quantify and even conceptualize, because we're often doing it all the time, sometimes in vicious ways and sometimes in potentially virtuous ways. The problem for freedom of expression with self-censorship is that what you get is this spiral of silence, where when you're not exposed to other forms of information and people that might be dissenting are not able to have the floor, let's say, there's less exposure to that expression, so there's less incentive for others to join that chorus. And so it creates this spiral where minority opinions just become much, much more of a minority. And so that's a part of the value of freedom of expression, and having people to be able to punctuate that silence from time to time so that others have social license in order to associate with that expression or have a thought that might align with that as well. Just to say really quickly about Indigenous reconciliation, we're lucky as political scientists to be able to be constantly talking about what's happening in the world, and I think the major thing to mention is just to invite more Indigenous peoples and scholars into academic conversations. And I'm lucky as a political scientist or somebody in political studies to have a wealth of literature contributed by Indigenous people to be the formal subject of conversation in political science classrooms. And I think that's an incredible gift to our field, and where some of the most interesting conversations are happening.
Yes, for sure. And while recognizing our Indigenous colleagues are overwhelmed with requests to speak and participate at the same time. Yeah.
Indeed.
Laura Mae, would you like to close us out on this?
I would be honored. First off, I just want to give a shout out to, at UW, the Office of Indigenous Relations and the Indigenous Student Center and the work that they do on campus. And the reason I want to do that as a starting point is because the system has tricked us into believing that change has to be slow, and they have found a variety of ways to create some pretty interesting system-wide changes that some of us may not be aware have happened. And so that seems to be like a pattern in the way that deeper equity work actually rolls. A lot of the changes that you're making aren't the ones that are celebrated in a news release. They are actually shifts in what understanding is required from people in positions of power at the institution. And so I just want to say thank you to them, because I also think we need to celebrate the wins even as the other things are happening. The other thing I want to raise is that there are a lot of people on campus, because of the type of work that they do, that have had to censor themselves in interesting, I'm saying that very loosely, only because I'm trying to do some good adulting right now, in interesting ways in order to keep doing the work on the ground that they do. And a lot of people that are truly deeply devoted to doing equity work are also deeply connected to community. And sometimes the strategies that people use require real thought about who it is that says what at what time. And so because of that, again, we don't necessarily know 110% who is doing what at any given time, especially in a moment like this where system levers are being reinterpreted to actually be harmful to people that are doing that deeper work. So for all of those that are doing it quietly and silently and feel alone as they're doing it, I just want you to know that we see you, and that we wouldn't be having many of these conversations unless if you weren't doing that kind of work on the ground. And in fact, I don't think that we would have a student body that is empowered enough to have these conversations if some people on this campus that may not be providing us with everything that we need were creating the conditions in which folks could creatively resist. And so that, my hope is that as we speak about this, that we don't rely too heavily on old policies, but instead look at the historic policies and make sure that the way that they are actually being used on the ground is doing what we think. And if it isn't, then we revise those. And I also hope that the people that are in positions of power at the institution, and here I mean the traditional power positions, push back against the government who is forcing a whole bunch of things that we also don't know about. There are a lot of things that happen at the senior level that regular folks on the ground don't know about. And I only know that because I used to be the critic for colleges and universities. And so I also want to give a bit of grace to the people that are in leadership right now who are trying to find ways to hold all of these things. And if there is ever a time that I can be helpful to those folks because I've had a foot in various spaces, then please reach out, because I would be more than willing to do the work that needs to be done for community.
Thank you. And I will turn it over to Dr. Ilkan for final comments. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for a really engaging session and for your thoughtful comments and questions. It was really excellent. Please join me though in thanking the two presenters and thanking our moderator for an excellent job. I would like to thank the Faculty of Arts and the Office of Research and the Provost's Office for their ongoing and generous support for this series, which started in September 2003. Really, it's just been fantastic working with everybody in those offices. I would like to also let you know about an upcoming event that's taking place on February the 27th at 3 o'clock, our usual time. And this event is, again, part of the series, and it's entitled Surveillance, Privacy, and Algorithmic Power in the Workplace. So it's something that really, I think it'll be another fantastic session. And the advertising for that panel will be starting, I believe, next week, so please look out for that. And thanks again, everybody, for really a wonderful engagement, and have a good rest of your day. And for those who are here right now, we have some little goods and sweet things and some drinks. So thanks again, everybody.